Okay, I think we can start with this third session today on Europe and the Mediterranean space after the onset of the Russian war on Ukraine. There has been a minor change in the panel because our colleague Andrea Dessy unfortunately cannot be with us today because of COVID. So I will be moderating this session. Now, when Andrea and I thought about how to conceptualize this panel, we thought that in Europe, with the illegal Russian invasion of Ukraine, we are starting to think about an epochal or historic turning point that has happened in Europe because war has actually returned to Europe. However, seen from many other areas in this world, and particularly from the Middle East and North Africa, there have been continuous historic turning point or ruptures, let's say, in this respect. Certainly in 2003 with the illegal US invasion of Iraq, which has caused ongoing conflict and unrest in the Middle East. And another important rupture has, of course, been the Arab uprisings in 2011, which are still ongoing, and the wars that began in Syria, Libya, and Yemen. So I think from a perspective of the Middle East, people have been living through decades of crisis now, in which the Russian war on Ukraine and the impact it has on augmenting already existing fragilities is another episode in an ongoing chain of crisis or even disasters. Thinking, for example, about the Beirut port explosion, which happened 2 years ago. So now in this panel, we will look into how exactly the war on Ukraine is impacting the Middle East and North Africa by contextualizing this into already existing trends and challenges, both from an overall security perspective, but also from a human security perspective. And to do so, we are very delighted to host such a distinguished panel here. And I will introduce the speakers before I pose questions to them. So we will start with Nassif Hitti, who has been long serving as a diplomat with the Arab League, but not only. And he has also been the former foreign minister of Lebanon. He is also a professor and lecturer at various universities in the Arab world and Europe, and is currently based at the Lebanese University, UZEK. And Nassif, I would ask you to start to set a little bit the context of this panel by elaborating on current issues, trends, and challenges in the Middle East and the Mediterranean region. Thank you.
Thank you. Let me just start by making a remark. I used to tell my students when I taught for a couple of years between my official functions, I used to tell them, do specialize in Middle East conflict studies because you are guaranteed a job for the coming 4 centuries. So it's a region really, how to put it, ripped with all kinds of conflicts. And very briefly, if we look today, we could see the following, that you have 3 wars in the Middle East. You have local wars that started because of local reasons in the countries where they started, but you have also what I call a regional civil war. Because of subnational and transnational identities, religious identities usually, people tend to fight somewhere else in the name of Allah, in the name of God, though opposing themselves to each other. That's a way of mobilization. And the third aspect here, which is very important, is war by proxies. Many regional powers and non-regional powers do use certain areas where there are really autonomous reasons for conflicts in order to instigate the conflict or play down, escalate or de-escalate the conflict. So this leads to what I call an anarchical regional order. There is an anarchical regional order where the state is a weak component. You have some mega states. A major change, like you mentioned, Nadia, 2003. What happened in 2003, instead of getting rid of a regime, regardless where we stand on the issue in Iraq, a country was destroyed. And Iraq, which was strategically a sort of Berlin Wall in front of, a balancing role in front of Iran, turned into a bridge for Iran to come into the Levant and the Levantine politics in general. These are some very macro important elements that we must take into consideration when we look at the region. What we have today is a spread of failing states and also of failed states in the region. What we have today, as I say, is this kind of regional civil war where in the name of Allah and of other ideologies, people are fighting different places, fighting on a territory not against those who are in power in that territory, but in the name of a sublime ideologies. Today you have some trends, and I'll go fast in order not to abuse of my time. Our colleague and friend will speak about the JCPOA, of course, which is influenced and does influence the other trends, ongoing trends in the region. There is something important that happened, some positive elements that happened in the region that tended to de-escalate a bit the tension. One is the normalization between Saudi Arabia, Egypt, and some other Arab countries with Turkey. When Turkey stopped playing an ideological role and turned to play a normal nation-state role, as we say, not supranational role in the region. That's an important. A second important matter that we must look at is the process that was launched, initiated on the 28th of August, last August in Iraq, the conference between enemies and adversaries in Baghdad that is supposed one day to launch a conference on security and cooperation in the Middle East or in the Middle East and the Mediterranean. It's an important uphill struggle, but it reflected a very important balancing role, a new role assumed by Iraq, a new balancing role of Iraq in the region, which is playing currently a very important mediating role, hosting and mediating and facilitating contacts between Iran and many other Arab countries. So in this trend, if the JCPOA could be used and misused for reasons beyond the agreement, whether it's reached or not, and I will not, of course, comment on that because our colleague will speak about it. The second trend is this trend, the conflict between conflict patterns and between conflict reduction, not settlement, conflict reduction patterns that are happening currently in the region regarding certain normalization. A third important, if we talk about JCPOA, if we talk about the normalization conflict pattern within the Arab region, and as I mentioned here, I would insist on one important point. What allowed for this role of Turkey and Iran is this imperial appetite that comes sometimes to large historical empires when they find a political vacuum. Nature hates vacuum, political nature hates more political vacuum. With the breakdown of a minimal Arab understanding that was acting as a locomotive in the region up to the beginning of the century, Iran and Turkey, in the name of Islamism and sectarism, find a very attractive milieu to intervene in the name of God, the same God, but on opposing ways, and sometimes in the name of the community. Currently, there is a beginning of a return to normalcy, of acting as a state, not acting as a revolution, speaking over the heads of the state. We are seeing some trends that might allow us to go back to a normal state system from an anarchical state system where, again, non-state actors of all kinds, whether terrorist organizations or religious organizations or nationalist organizations, fight for the ummah. And the concept of the ummah, the nation, is not a territorial concept, ladies and gentlemen. It's a religious, sectarian, spiritual, ethnic conflict that does not really abide by the existing states. This explains why this milieu of the Middle East really is highly integrated in terms of conflict capacity and interaction among different conflicts. Another comment will go to Syria. There is a process of normalization in Syria. And I always, when you talk about Syria, remember the late Patrick Seal's words that in his famous book, The Struggle for Syria, he who wins Syria wins the Middle East. He who controls Syria controls the Middle East. It's at the heart of the Levant and of the heart of the region. And what we see is a process of normalization. The regime in Syria did not lose the military war, definitely, but will not alone achieve political peace or win the peace. Syria today, there is a competition, ongoing competition between two key actors in Syria, Russia and Iran. And here when we mentioned that Russia is too much taken by the situation in Ukraine, of course, but Russia will never drop the Middle East because part of its source and its growth in greatness as a superpower is being in the Middle East, particularly being in Syria, particularly being able to be on the eastern side of the Mediterranean, which is gaining today in importance because of gas, of closeness to Europe, of the need of gas for Europe, and the ongoing competition even Even Gulf countries now are positioning themselves in this basin for competition and conflict. What I'm suggesting here that we are still in an anarchical regional order where there are not yet a set of rules that are governing relations. There are processes toward normalization, starting with what I mentioned about the Iraq summit process, what the normalization, not under the table, over the table between Syria and certain countries, but we still have very hot points like Syria, like Yemen. This is a triangle of Bermuda, Syria, Yemen, and of course Libya, where we could go back to an anarchical situation. I'll stop here and trying perhaps later to clarify more or deepen more some points or some questions. Thank you.
Certainly in the question and answers. Thank you so much for this broad overview. We will now in fact turn to the JCPOA and the state of play here, a very topical issue. And we are delighted to have with us Cornelius Adeba, who is non-resident fellow at Carnegie Europe. He is also associate fellow at DI at the German think tank DGAP and the Hertie School of Governance. And he has also been lecturer at various international universities. I'm mentioning just two because of the research topic, which is Tehran University and Georgetown University. So the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Daniela. Thank you very much to the IAI for inviting me. It's a pleasure to be here in Turin again, which is in fact the place where I came during my PhD research. And so it's good to be back. Talking about the JCPOA in 5 minutes is not a small feat. I will try to do it in a way that you can take at least something with you back home, and that is by going through the odd single-digit numbers. So that's 1, 3, 5, 7, 9. Okay. There is one remaining issue for the JCPOA to be revived, and that is the question of the delisting of the Revolutionary Guards, which is on the US terror lists, and that has been a sticking point for the past 3 months at least, since talks broke down in Vienna. Last week there was a bit of a revival, an attempt to revive the talks in Qatar, but we are nowhere there, and this is still the one sticking point. Why is that so? Because there are at least three countries that have domestic politics. You know probably about the United States, a slim majority in the Senate, the slimmest possible majority in the US Senate. Midterm elections to come. There is little appetite among the White House, the Democrats, the president to risk whatever upheaval that might follow from a deal with Iran. And the president said at the beginning of his term that he would revive the JCPOA. He hasn't managed, as I said, for a number of domestic reasons. You might be surprised to hear that also Iran has domestic issues. We always hear about a hardline government, hardline parliament. The hardliners have taken over, but that precisely puts them under pressure. They have to deliver something to an audience, not just the people, but inside the elite circles. They have to deliver on the JCPOA something that is more than what could have been reached about a year ago under the previous government, when one was already close to a deal. So that's why they insist on this delisting. And there is also Israel, which has a domestic audience and a shaky government, as you know. The former Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu would be pleased to hammer his successor about, seeing a deal being signed under his watch. So 3 parties with domestic audiences prevent a return to the JCPOA. There are also 5 nuclear powers, 5 recognized nuclear powers. One of them conducting a war in Ukraine, by the way. But that's precisely the issue. Because there are nuclear weapons out there, it is possible for Russia to go unpunished. End of story. If it wouldn't be that case, we would be in a different situation. Just keep that in mind when you think about the JCPOA being like a minor agreement, not so important. This whole idea about disarmament being something of the 1970s and 1980s, old stories, gray-haired men talking about these things. That may be the case. It's not fully true, but it is something which is of actual value even today, and which is one of the reasons why the JCPOA needs to be revived still. 7. Well, if it hadn't been for the United States jumping ship and abandoning the agreement, we would have seen the JCPOA to be implemented for 7 years by now. 2015 in July it was signed, summer of 2022. Just imagine 7 years of continued implementation on both sides, sanctions lifting, Iran being permanently under stringent inspections, under controls, having limits to nuclear-enriched uranium, having limits to what they can do with centrifuges, with research and development. We would be in a different world, wouldn't we? I mean, again, not entirely thanks to the history of the Middle East being a conflictuous place maybe, but we would have one less conflict to deal with, and we would not be so worried about the developments precisely in this region. So that is something that was the original idea, that was what the JCPOA was signed with, and the idea of building initiatives of regional security on the JCPOA could only have been managed if it had been implemented for all these years. 9, I guess 9 would be an all another story. So I look at Daniela's face thinking I have 9 seconds left. So I will just thank you for your attention and look forward to the discussion.
Well, thank you so much. I will remember that, certainly. We will now turn a little bit more from the geopolitical side to human security, and to how EU migration policy also has evolved in relation to crisis in the Mediterranean region, but not only, but of course also in relation to that. And we are very honored to have with us Ümmühan Bardak. She is a senior specialist on labor market and migration at the European Training Foundation, and her research focuses on labor market, migration, employment, and capacity building in the European neighborhood region, East and South. And we are very happy to have you with us because we have also already cooperated before in the NewMed project, so it's a pleasure to continue this cooperation. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Well, I work for the European Training Foundation, which is based in Villa Goalino, and we work basically on the human capital development issues with the European neighborhood region, which means that I'm not going to talk about security issues, but more linked to the human movements, migration, and mobility issues. Let's start with the basic facts about the European external migration policy. Well, first of all, EU member states have still full sovereignty over their national migration policies. So the EU's role as institution is limited with coordination, bringing new proposals forward, always up to the decision and unanimous decision of the EU member states. So whatever we see in the field of migration policy from the EU, it's not technical. It's always political shaped by the EU member states, among the negotiations among the member states. The second is that more or less since 2011, there was a clear, let's say, communication since then, which is called Global Approach to Europe, Global Approach to Migration and Mobility. EU has developed an external migration policy which is non-binding and flexible because of the member states' sovereignty over the issue, but based on 4 pillars, basically. The first pillar is preventing irregular movements, controlling the borders. The second is opening legal pathways to migration, especially labor migrants, which European labor markets need. The third one is promoting asylum seeking and international protection, so that it's not only the EU member states, but also other countries in the world who have the same understanding of Geneva Convention to protect asylum seekers. And the last and fourth pillar is improving development impact of migration for the third countries, mainly through international development assistance. So basically, EU tries to combine a multitude of the policies which can be carrots and sticks all together, around these 4 pillars to secure the European borders. And when we talk about European borders, as you know all, there are 2 important areas. One is on the east, because this is one of the key irregular routes, and the other one from the south. So to secure the eastern part, EU has already a lot of arrangements, agreements, policies. First of all, with the 6 Western Balkan countries, because they are already an enlargement region, so candidates, signed association agreements, but not only, they also signed readmission agreements, all of them, also Turkey, which means that they would accept any irregular migrant who is caught up in Europe and passed through their country, even if this person is not their national, they have to accept them back. This is the content of the readmission agreement in return for visa facilitation. That's why all 5 Western Balkan countries have visa-free entry into the EU, except Kosovo. Turkey is still not yet on that, but it also signed the readmission agreement. And then Eastern Partnership countries, the so-called 6 countries, including Ukraine, Belarus, Moldova, Azerbaijan, Georgia, and Armenia, they also signed, all of them, association agreements, and 3 of them, Ukraine, Georgia, and Moldova, are, in terms of governments' policies, very pro-European. They signed deep and comprehensive free trade agreement with the EU, as well as readmission agreements, which means that the eastern borders, let's say, are largely secured. In the sense that these countries are, of course, also countries of source and transit, that is clear. But in terms of demographic structure, apart from Ukraine and Turkey, most of these countries are small and also demographically speaking very similar to the EU, which means that their population are aging and they are actually decreasing, even including Turkey. A bit less, but still it is on the decline side, let's say. The main migrants coming from East, therefore, become Middle East, as we know from Syria, but also Iraq, Iran, as well as a new road, also new for Turkey, is Afghanistan and Pakistan, asylum seekers from Afghanistan and Pakistan. This is the main route. On the south side, let's say, EU also tried to do similar arrangements. It signed with Morocco, Tunisia, and Lebanon mobility partnerships, so-called. And these mobility partnerships included exactly the 4 pillars, basically. However, the cooperation and collaboration between the EU and these countries have not been going very smoothly. None of the countries have signed readmission agreements, for example. And EU, despite the fact that it wanted to sign similar agreements with Algeria, Egypt, and also Jordan signed it already, another Libya, they were not interested, basically. So the southern borders are, let's say, in the perception of the EU, yes, a bit less secure. Also, in this, looking at also the, let's say, geostrategical position of the countries, first of all, most of these countries have, North Africa, I'm talking about specifically, have larger populations. There is less, let's say, demographically still needs further advancement, so there are still increasing populations. But the most importantly, North Africa is the door for sub-Saharan human movements. And this will continue to do so even more in the future, because please remember that South Africa, Sub-Saharan Africa is the area with the highest growth of population in the world. I stop here for this first one.
Thank you so much, Ömüran. In fact, I would like to have a second round, maybe which focuses a little bit more on EU foreign policy, after which we have now set a little bit more the general context. And why am I interested in that? Let me shortly set the stage for this. I think if we look into the past decade of EU foreign policy in the Middle East and North Africa, so since the onset of the Arab uprising, I think what we noted is an increasing absence of the European Union as a union and an increasing presence instead of some member states in the region. And we can see this absence very much in the lack of a shared vision for security, for example, in the region, as the Barcelona process represented. We can see it in the lack of finding a shared solidarity approach towards the migration, so-called migration crisis in 2015. And we can also see that the EU is much less present in conflicts in the region, even areas which have been traditionally of key concern for the EU, such as Israel and Palestine, for example. Now, I think this absence of the EU has become even clearer with the Russian war on Ukraine. Why? Because finally the European Union got its acts together and the member states could act coherently with concrete measures and instruments against such a grave violation of international law. And the European Union has also found a solidarity response to the migration or to the refugee flow coming from Ukraine in line with international law. Now, I think this asymmetry of EU presence vis-à-vis the East and unpresence in the South poses a problem for the European Union, which it isn't really aware of right now. I'm a bit concerned that with all its energies going towards the East, it's not aware that this poses a reputational problem for the European Union in the South. And why is this of concern? I think our world is increasingly multiplex, so not only multipolar, but multiplex. Multiplexity is a term coined by Amitav Acharya, which means that the world is increasingly like a multiplex cinema with various power centers, and each power center has kind of like a film on the offer. Now, the European Union, I think, has a lot of attraction, obviously, in the East right now, but this attraction is clearly missing increasingly in the South. So I think we need to look at how the EU can actually fill this void that it currently has vis-à-vis the South, and looking at current trends in this respect in EU policies. So I would go back to our speakers to briefly reflect on this, and to Nassif, I would be particularly interested to ask you about this issue that you mentioned, the return to normalcy in the region, and the hope that the Baghdad conference and the role of Iraq represents, and if you think the European Union can play a role in supporting this, or if it should better keep out of it, actually.
No, I think, let me start by the end. I think the European Union has an interest in playing a role toward that. I remember I was participating in my personal capacity as an expert during the preparation for the Euromed partnership. And my suggestion was that to our European friends, if you don't help exporting part of the solution, you're going to import all the problems from the South. So basically, it's extremely important that to have an approach based on shared stakeholders about that matter. It's extremely important for Europe to help stabilizing the southern shores of the Mediterranean. On this particular issue, of course, I think the Union for the Med is playing a certain role, but basically in social, economic, developmental matters. But we need to see some European role in the political matter. That's very important in the political matter. And we have an architecture of cooperation, Euro-Arab dialogue, 5+5, 5+12, Union for the Med, and all these. So there is a need today to think by focusing on certain issues, political issues, whereas Europe could play a certain role, particularly now that if we talk, for instance, about the quartet concerning the Arab-Israeli conflict, there is no way that the Americans will sit with the Russians today. So basically here, there is a possibility, a chance, and a responsibility for Europe to try to move on this particular matter.
Thank you so much. Kind of a similar question to Cornelius, which would be, what role can the EU actually play now to save the JCPOA?
Well, the EU is trying to play this role, and for example, the talks last week, they were preceded by Josep Borrell, the High Representative, actually going to Tehran, talking to the Iranian foreign minister at his level, and making it possible for the United States and Iran to meet indirectly again in Qatar, where we had EU diplomats shuttling between those two delegations. So the fact that the two won't speak with one another is mirrored in this particular negotiation format. That's a short response. I want to comment on your point about the presence of the EU in the East. Well, it doesn't show on the picture that we see behind us, I have to say. You remember that the day when these three gentlemen, or four gentlemen, I mean, I don't recognize the German Chancellor on this picture, but I couldn't care. But there is President Johannes still in the background, who got dropped in the news usually. So four gentlemen traveling to Kiev. The lady from the EU had long been there, Ursula von der Leyen. So one could have chosen a different picture if one wanted to tell a different story. So there is an EU presence, certainly in Ukraine, so no doubt about that. The presence of the EU on the Iran file, as much as I applaud it, I would criticize the EU for focusing only on the nuclear file and neglecting issues like regional security. There has been so much involvement in Brussels with the E3, so France, Germany, and the United Kingdom, and the EU as an institution, on this particular file, that those countries, including the EU, that they somehow neglected all the other issues. So what is going on in neighboring Iraq is a big issue. The relations between Saudi Arabia and Iran and the regional countries. This is again an instance where member states dominate the discussions, where bilateral issues with member states, and I don't have to name the names here, they are much more dominant than whatever the EU can do. So my criticism of the EU also goes to the member states who don't want these regional security initiatives to be taken by the EU.
Thank you so much, Cornelius. So to go back to migration, I think that actually the EU can learn a lot from its own response to the East in this respect. And so I would like to ask you to elaborate a little bit how EU migration policy has evolved since the war on Ukraine. Thank you.
Thank you. Well, as you may remember, after the invasion of Russia in Ukraine on 24th of February, for around 4 or 5 days, there was no response. Nobody was actually clear that there could be such a joint response. Nobody expected that. I can tell you from within the EU institutional discussions. Everything comes after 4 or 5 days, and I think there are a number of factors that contributed to this common response eventually. First of all, the EU Temporary Protection Directive, which was actually adopted in 2001 after the Yugoslavian wars, never used before. It was invoked in March 2022 by the unanimous vote in the European Council, so that those Ukrainians fleeing war had the right, get the right to temporary protection. For me, the main factors are the following. The first one is, I think, the success of the Ukrainian president, Zelensky, in terms of putting the war and setting the discourse through his communication campaign about the war, where there are also real facts, but I think he was extremely successful in putting the war against a common enemy, a common aggressor, a war between free and democratic European states versus an authoritarian and expansionist Russia. And this was, I really think that he was one of the factors which mobilized in the first days the public opinion in the EU. The second factor, in my opinion, is the active role of Eastern European member states, within the EU mechanism. I mean specifically Poland here, but not only Poland, also the Baltic countries, Lithuania, Lithuania, Estonia, Czech Republic as well. They were able to mobilize the EU against the common aggressor because they were empathizing fully with Ukraine. And also, you may know that Poland is almost like a big brother for Ukraine for a while now, since the, in becoming independent states. And also don't forget that Poland annually, before the war, was giving residence permission, on average almost 1 million Ukrainians every year for temporary work. So already there were millions of Ukrainians coming and entering to work in Poland, and this war really accelerated this process. I would like to compare this with the promoter member states for the South, because I think this is the key. Also, there is a lesson for Italy, in my opinion. For the southern countries, the internal EU member states, which are promoting the relations, for the North Africa, it's obvious, France, Italy, Spain. Germany, not really. I mean, okay, it is there, but it is, the country is still far from active defensive and defense and foreign policy. So, and the relations between France and Tunisia, Morocco, for example, it's not like the relations between Poland and Ukraine. Not at all. Actually, the colonial past even complicates the relationship. There is a lack of trust, basically. And within the EU, as you know, within the EU institutions and mechanisms, when there is a discussion about Morocco, it is France who takes the initiative. And when it takes the initiative, of course, it follows the whole historical perspective. And it is in a way captured because the interest of Poland or Lithuania or Sweden for Morocco is naturally much less than their interest for Ukraine. And this should be kept very carefully in mind. If we look at the Middle Eastern countries, traditionally these countries were the main interest of UK before UK left the EU, and then of course taken by the United States, so it's mainly still the business of United States. It's not the business of Europe. Well, Syria was a bit of business of France, but it is no longer the case, let's put it that way. And this makes a complete reaction of the EU differently, impact negatively, because you need some internal promoters of the member states in order to get meaningful response from the European Union, because European Union doesn't take decisions by its bureaucracy. It takes decisions by its member states. So it's not the EU, actually, at the end of the day. It's the member states which makes decisions. Well, of course, there are negotiations, different formulas of, yes. Okay, and then last thing I would like to emphasize also is the absolute majority of the Ukrainian refugees were women and children. I think this makes a big difference in public opinion, because men were not allowed to leave the country. They had to fight. And this puts sometimes, I saw many comments in the social media in that sense. I think social media is interesting to follow in that, which says that it's in sharp contrast with young, able-bodied men who are asylum seekers from, let's say, Syria. And this changes, the women and children, they change, I think, also the protective feelings in the public opinion. And last point is also the perceived higher level of human capital among the people coming from Ukraine, in general from the Eastern European countries, because the education levels of average education levels of population is much higher, which is also reflected in the refugees, among the refugees. And all these factors together, if you remember, Bulgarian Prime Minister made a comment about these people. He said, these Ukrainian people, they are not migrants, they are not, which means they are not poor, they are not uneducated. They are with high-skilled human capital, which can contribute essentially very comprehensively to the European labor market, which is in the shortages, of course, not in every member state, but majority of the member states.
Thank you so much. After stressing the panelists very much with the time, we have 20 minutes for question and answer from the audience. So I think someone has a microphone. I see Natalie.
Muhammad, I had a question for you. I was really intrigued by the analysis, because indeed there are parts of what you were saying that one has heard already before, the women, children point, but especially the member state point you made was really interesting, and I wondered if I could press you a little bit further on it. You make the contrast between, on the one hand, Poland, Ukraine, the feeling of brotherhood, the embrace, the solidarity, and it was that solidarity that then filtered, in a sense, within the European Union in terms of others' solidarity. Is it therefore the case that, because if we take a country like Italy with respect to the South, the solidarity that was being invoked was only a solidarity with other member states, and the narrative was a sharing of the burden, rather than a feeling, a lack, and that is a consequence of a lack of a feeling of solidarity between Italy, in a sense, and migrants or refugees coming from the South, that oddly, or perhaps not oddly, in fact, actually, if one thinks of it very rationally, completely, how can I say, sort of hollowed out from within the Italian call vis-a-vis other member states, basically, for solidarity. I mean, is that the argument that you're making?
Well, of course, this is just an observation. This is not an official position or something. It's really my personal observation. But I think that basically, in terms of relations, Italy's position, for example, is quite unique in terms of how can I say, gaining trust and promoting the interests of the countries it is interested in, like North African countries, within the EU. But for this to happen, there has to be a trustworthy relationship between Italy and Tunisia, Italy and Libya, which is not really the case yet. But still, they know better than the others, like in France. They definitely know much better than the other member states, but still, I think the nature of the relationship, because of the history and the way how all things developed, it is the lack of trust between the parties, for me, is the main reason. But for Italy, I think they are, it is a unique position which can develop this thing, because only if there is a trustworthy relationship between one EU member state and one on the other side of the country happens, then things can move very quickly. Because then the other country also will start to cooperate much more than usual. Today, we have all the mechanisms, Euro, Mediterranean partnership. There is a UFM secretariat, which is based in Barcelona. Well, they have a big budget funded by the EU. EU doesn't spend less money on the southern part. This I have to emphasize. Actually, it spends more money than East. So the main issue is to show that you are serious and there is a common ground for mutual interests. And for that to happen, I don't think this will come from Sweden or Finland or Poland. I think this will can come only these three countries, Italy, Spain, and France. And in that sense, they need to be more active. Also, it is linked with the historical foreign policies of these three countries, of course. I mean, there are many factors to explain, but by definition, the interests of these three countries are very much in line with better relations with the North Africa, for example. So there is a room for improvement, basically.
Thank you. Other questions? Yes?
I would like to follow up on Natalie's point. I thought it was an excellent point to your very informed comments, and in two ways. Poland and Ukraine had a very horrible history in the 20th century, and and they were able to turn that around.
Exactly.
So I think how they did that, and if there's a lesson to be learned, would be very important. And they shouldn't forget that there's another EU member country in the Mediterranean called Greece. And Greece has excellent relations with Egypt, let's say. In fact, Egypt sent its navy to do joint exercises in 2020, August 2020, right when the clash happened. So, what does that say? And if you think about the United Arab Emirates, now Greece and the United Arab Emirates have an Article 5 pact of mutual defense. So what does that say about how countries like Spain and Italy and France should view a real partnership? Greece, I would argue, has more of a sense of a partnership with with Egypt and, let's say, some Arab countries more so. Where do you think there should be more parity in the relationship?
More?
Parity.
Yes. Well, yes, Greece, it's a very good point. But I would like to remind you that part of the motives behind Greece's foreign policy is against Turkey. I mean, it's very much conditioned by its own geographical... Yes. But yes. I mean, that's definitely a possibility. Greece is among them. Also Portugal, although they have this interest for Latin America, like Spain. Countries just follow their... I mean, there is a path dependency. You cannot really change that. In terms of parity, well, it's difficult, of course. There is an issue also linked with, well, I'm working in human capital development area, so I'm really not a security analyst at all. So what I can say is that human resources in any given country makes a big difference on everything, including defense. What I mean? I meant that, I do analysis in terms of human capital pool of the countries in all the regions. And I can tell you that in the eastern part, there is a higher education level per se. Well, you can say Soviet Union legacy. And you can also criticize maybe the quality of education, but do you know that around 80% of the total young population in Ukraine go to university? Out of 100 young person, 80 goes to the university. This number is, I think in Morocco it's around 30 out of 100. In Lebanon it's high, actually. It's more than 50. But in most of the countries, there are a lot of real people's need in education, health, the basic life standards. And if you look at that, EU can make a tremendous difference, actually, in people's life. But what is happening so far is that there is a lot of development assistance coming from the EU to the countries, but somehow the impact, the money goes, I don't know where. The impact is very small. It doesn't reach to the individuals, basically. It goes to the intermediaries, but not they don't make the difference in individuals' lives, not yet. And this was not the case for some projects when the Berlin Wall collapsed in the East. There were much more exchanges, people-to-people contacts, I mean. And this is what we need, in my opinion, more people-to-people contact, more platforms to come together, to discuss together, to understand each other better. And there, I always say the investment in human capital is also key.
Thank you so much. Other questions? Yes?
Thank you very much. Thanks for the great contribution, and thanks to all the panelists for the great introduction on a variety of topics. Staying on the issue of migration, don't you think that in the public discourse, at least in Italy, but also across EU member states, we need to clarify the two different issues of asylum on the one hand and long-term migration on the other hand. Sometimes it seems that there is a little bit of confusion on the two different issues, because asylum is an issue which is short-term. It is framed within international law and regulation. There is an obligation to support asylum seeker for EU member states, and is one thing. A completely different thing is the very long-term issue of migration, which has to do with economics, with the demographic dynamics. We have an aging population. As Umad said, our neighbor, Africa, is a hugely dynamic, demographically speaking, continent. And so these are completely two different things that sometimes I fear in the public discourse are a little bit blurred. So I wanted to, if you can expand a little bit on this, that would be great. Thanks a lot.
You want? Okay. Okay, yes. Well, of course, international definition is anyone who is living from his country of birth for at least 1 year is called migrant. This is very blunt definition, really. So there are differences. There are economic migrants, labor migrants, there are asylum seekers, there are family reunification members, there are international students, which, by the way, EU want to attract them all. So very different migrant groups. Well, in terms of EU migration policy, there is always difference on these aspects, because there is the asylum seeking part there is the Dublin regulation, how the member states should show the solidarity towards the asylum applications. There is the temporary protection directive. But on the labor migration, what we can say on the labor migration is that there is an increasing interest and appetite on the EU side for labor migration. I think everybody accepts that EU needs more workers, basically. But partly because of the public opinion, and also partly because of the countries which are more actively seeking immigrants, like Germany. The discourse is very much on medium and high-skilled migrants. Remember, again, the migration policy is also shaped by the member states. If you take Italian labor market, for example, the need for labor migrants, it's not for high-skilled. It's actually for the low-skilled. And there are certain sectors like care sector, construction, hospitality, agriculture. So it needs low-skilled migrants, which was the case in Germany in 1950s, by the way. But now in Germany, they need medium and high-skilled. The same with all the Nordic countries. I mean, also Netherlands, Belgium, UK. I mean, all the North is really in need of, dire need of immigrant workers. So the discourse is very high on the agenda, and EU has already several, let's say, several directives. For example, there is a directive of blue card for highly skilled workers, as you know, and this is open to every country. It's not targeting one country or another. Both East and South countries can benefit from that. There is a seasonal worker directive which focuses on low skill. There is a directive for researchers, students, voluntary service, pupil exchanges. There is a directive on intra-corporate transfers. There is a directive for the right to family reunification, or the third country nationals who are long-term residents. So actually, at the EU level, there are a lot of initiatives already. The problem is each member state is supposed to implement these rules, but in their own way, which means that actually one from a third country national can be lost. Which country applies which directive how? Because there is not one labor market. There are 27 labor markets, 27 different languages. So it's more complicated than just US labor market, for example. Yes, okay. I stop here.
No, because I mean, it's very interesting, I think, that in the end, our discussion with all these other topical geopolitical issues on the table focuses very much on migration. That's an interesting observation. But I would like to give the other two speakers a chance to maybe also reflect on migration from their perspective in the last 2 minutes. So I will start in reverse order with Cornelius and give you the last word. Thank you. 2 minutes each.
Okay. No, thank you very much. And I took it that Nicolo's question was also directed to everyone. And thank you very much for pointing to that important difference, because I do feel bad when I hear human capital in the same sentence as Ukrainian refugees, because this is not why the people left their country. I mean, they didn't come to be seen as human capital. They came because they were fleeing a war. And that, makes them maybe more welcome refugees from a country's standpoint, for very material reasons. But we haven't even asked them whether they want to stay as laborers, as high-qualified laborers. I recall a discussion from the beginning of the war in Germany where Ukrainians were dead against that children going to German schools because they wanted them to be taught in Ukrainian, online, everything was set up, because they didn't want them to even start integrating because they thought they would go home after 3 months or 5 months. So, I mean, that's a very delicate issue. Because it's so delicate, I will talk about Iran. Iranians are very often seen as first-class migrants because they come as doctors, as engineers, and that puts them, ahead of the others coming from that region, and that creates difficulties and, of course, opportunities also. The difficulty is that if you're an Iranian migrant, there is a lot of pressure on you to succeed in your new country, in your host country. But of course, there are also networks of migrants that can help you. I mean, if there are some doctors and engineers already in that country, and you're maybe distantly related to them, that will help help you arrive in that country also in your profession. Last point, it was the Vice President for the Environment of Iran who some 5 years ago warned of millions of Iranians coming as climate refugees because the country is drying, because the country is basically running out of water and more areas are becoming inhabitable. So let's think about where the real threats are coming from and why people are leaving, and try to go to those conflicts or these environmental issues and solve them at the source rather than manage the migration flows as they come. Thank you.
Thanks, Cornelius. Nassif?
I'm here to perhaps say something. I found it extremely, let me say, demoralizing, if I may say so. In the 90s and the first decade of the century, there was a very strong interest in developing cooperation between the two shores of the Mediterranean. Suddenly it turned into something technical. I'm not saying it's not important, talking about climatic changes, Union for the Med, and so on and so to speak. And this is why I come back to the same idea. We have to create a better understanding, to have a more inclusive approach, a more comprehensive approach. And this is why I go to what I call the 4 legs of the table. There is a political security leg for dialogue. There should be a civil society one. There should be one on economic and social developmental matter, and there should be one on the cultural and educational matter. Let's not forget that matter. We need to change the image of the other, to stop demonizing. Even if we don't have, I don't know how to say the diplomacy, not to say it publicly, we think of it, that the other is a bad, the demonization. So we need to democratize dialogue, to create comprehensive, because each one goes to one point of history to build on it, whether it's positive or negative. About it. And as we see that there is much more interest, more Mediterranean countries which are not Mediterranean are becoming part of Mediterranean. I mentioned at the beginning of my talk the Gulf countries. So what we need to work is on that matter. I think it's extremely important to promote this idea of the democratization of dialogue that allows better understanding of the other, to stop demonizing the other and to look directly into a problem where there is a problem by using this table of 4 legs. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much. There's a lot of work to do. And thanks for all your input. This has been an excellent discussion. Thank you.